All right, so we are on to chapter 2. Chapter 2 is called simply Slavery. And I wish you guys could see these pictures better, but you have that amazing blue background. And then you have the young boy in the front. And you can see in the bottom, just those little cabins. It's almost like he's on a street. But he really stands out against that blue sky. Okay? So the quote on the beginning of the page says, "Dem days was hell." Delia Garlick, former slave from Alabama. So those are her words. So dem days she's talking about are going to be days of being a slave, slavery days. This may sound funny to you, but my grandfather Joseph didn't allow any of his kin to eat black-eyed peas on New Year's Day, even though it's an old African American tradition. The beans bring good luck for the coming year, they say, but Pap, which is what we called him, wouldn't hear of it. When he was a young boy, each New Year's Day, buckets of black-eyed peas were boiled and poured into a horse trough for all the slaves on the plantation to eat like animals. Pap hated it and vowed that none of us in his family would ever allow people to treat us that way. So a horse trough is like that big, now it would be metal or back then would be wooden thing that they pour the food in that the animals eat out of. So when they gave them their black-eyed peas on New Year's Day, they fed them like they were animals and they had to eat right out of the trough. So that made him think about the way that he was treated, so he won't let his family eat them, which makes sense if you think about it. Pap was the only African-born slave in my family. Pap was captured in 1850 when he was only 6 years old and brought to America. Even though it had been illegal to capture and import slaves to America since 1807, it still happened, and often. On New Year's Day of every year, Pap told us the story. "When I was a child, I would play with all the other children in my village, while we done grown folk were working away in the fields. They told us to look out for kidnappers, because there were stories of people who went missing." We'll come back to that picture in a minute. "Children left at home during the day. One day, when the grown folk were gone out to the field, several of those people ran into the village, carrying nets and clubs, and grabbed me and several other children, for we could cry out. They covered our mouths, tied our hands, and ran off with us into the woods." So we were learning about slavery. Remember we talked about how they would raid villages for slaves sometimes when people were out working, and they would capture them and then bring them to the coast and trade those slaves to the Europeans for cloth, guns, rum, things like that. So that's how he ended up there. Not because of war or anything like that, but because he was captured while his family was out working in the fields. And this is a picture of one of the slave ships. So we talked about that. We talked about the Middle Passage. So this is kind of like, you have the white people looking down there, and you have all of them kind of crowded in the top of the boat there. Okay. All right. And then here, you have kind of just like a backdrop of Africa. So it says, "The children were marched for miles all the way to the coast, where a large ship sat out on the water. For days, Pap and many other captured Africans were kept inside a large fort on the beach before they were brought outside and paddled in a small boat to the ship. Below the deck, African men, women, and children were packed like fish, chained together and crammed into spaces so tight they could not stand up. It was dark, and the air was heavy with the smell of sickness and the cries of women and children. When the ship was full, it was set off for America. The trip lasted several weeks. Pap was sold to a planter in Maryland as a playmate for his son. Throat's getting a little dry. So his grandfather, when he was brought to Virginia, was sold in order to play with the master's son. So what happened a lot of times on plantations is plantations kind of like, they were huge farms, so they were spread apart, and it wasn't like you were living in a town close to your neighbors or anything like that. Some of those plantations are hundreds of acres. So or even thousands when the colonies first started. But what they would do a lot of times is when the master's children were little and the slave children were little, they would let them play. And so it was kind of like they were almost like they were all the same when they were little. They were just playing together and hanging out together. But then as they got older, they would separate them and try to make sure that the white children knew that the black children were slaves and they weren't as good as them and all that kind of stuff. So when they were little, without knowing any better, they just played with each other like anybody would. And then as they got older, they had to teach them that they weren't as good as they were. So, when he reached the age of 7, so he was hired to be a playmate, but when he reached the age of 7, Pap was set out to work as a field hand. So by 7 years old, he was already too old to be able to play anymore, and he had to go out and work. I could tell you about the life of a slave all day long, but even though you couldn't guess the awfulness of it, slaves are people who are property of other people and must do whatever they are told. They were bought and sold as one would buy and sell an animal or thing. Slaves had no right to property, to family, to come and go as they pleased, to read or write, or to speak their own language, or have a last name. No right even to protect themselves. No more rights than a horse or a pig. The only right a slave had was to work for his master, and work he did. Every morning the slave driver blew the work horn or rang the bell, and all the slaves woke up, grabbed a hoe, and headed out to the fields. In the summertime, the sun was up early and down late, and the air was hot, heavy, and full of mosquitoes. With each strike of the hoe to the ground, the slaves sang to keep time with each other and help ease the hard work. Spirituals were born right there in that field, you know. Singing was the only way to keep from dying inside. Pap said it was the saddest thing in the world to hear slaves sing those songs, but it sounded so beautiful. It made him want to cry. Some of those songs held secrets too, codes to pass on messages to other slaves right under the nose of the overseer. Like when a slave started singing, "Steal away," folks knew it was time to run away. Or when they sang, "Follow the drinking gourd," the slaves knew to escape in the direction of the North Star at the foot of the Little Dipper. You can see the kind of stormy looking picture. And in the background, all that white stuff are cotton fields. And then you just barely see little people carrying cotton over their heads out of the fields. Right. To ease the trouble of their hard lives, the slaves got together and danced on Saturday evenings. Most other evenings they slipped off into the woods for prayer meetings, praying for the day that freedom would come. Since Pap didn't have any blood family on the plantation, other slaves took him in as their own. Before he went out to the fields, he lived in a big house with a woman he called Aunt Hattie, who worked all day under the watchful eye of the missus, cooking, cleaning, sewing, even nursing the missus' children when they needed milk. She raised all the missus' children. There were about 100 or so slaves on the plantation, and they were always hungry and dressed in rags. Most of them went barefoot because the master didn't give them but one pair of shoes a year, and the shoes weren't made to last. In the fields, they were watched over by an overseer who rode around on a horse making sure everybody was doing their work. And honey, that fellow was mean. To keep the slaves in line, he lashed them with a curling bullwhip he kept on his shoulder, tied them to a tree, and whipped them right in front of all the other field hands. Folks a mile away could hear the awful whippings. It was no wonder so many of the slaves wanted to run away. You might wonder, why didn't they fight back? Child, believe me when I tell you that they did, every step of the way, but unlike their fellow Africans who captured them, they didn't have any guns to fight back with. So they fought back with their fists and died. They fought over the ocean on slave ships and were shot and drowned. They fought in the fields, in homes, and in factories where they worked and were whipped, beaten, and murdered. They fought and lost almost every time. It would be a long while before we figured out that we could not win our freedom with fists or guns. We would need to find another way. And so ends chapter 2.